What I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about some of the historical issues with oceanic whaling. So this material is something that one of the postdocs that we had here helped me prepare. So I'd like to acknowledge her help in preparing this and trying to come up with some relevant historical context and maybe some other things around this area. So really, why did we start catching whales? Well, you can see that we're a whole range of products here, some of the things using the baleen. Primarily, we were really talking about oil. So the spermaceti is a particular type of oil from the sperm whale that had a very high lumen content, so that means that it burns very brightly, and we had general oil from them. So you can see that turtle, that whale meat sign is actually a North Korean can. So, but we had basically a range of products coming from whales. What did we catch? So we really can divide whales up into toothed whales and baleen whales. And baleen whales are most of the whales. The toothed whales, where we have our killer whales, and we have our famous one from Moby Dick as a sperm whale. You can see we have just a range of different classifications that we go in here. But most of the whales that we're going to have across don't have teeth, that rather they have that fine baleen that they can use for filtering, and that historically was used for a range of products, including some clothing items. What's really the sort of the life cycle of these guys, and how does that play out from our perspective? So you have this sort of feeding, breeding cycle where we, accumulating and moving from one set of waters to another. So we see this movement from tropical regions to the Arctic regions. And if we can look at that, you can see that, of course, from our perspective, that means that we are going to see whales on our coast, which is a fortunate thing for us now. So we see these migration patterns for different whales. Here I've just identified some, and you can see that the one that is of, I guess, relevance for us here in the west is that one where I'm showing you, which is taking us up to Ningaloo down from the Arctic. And we certainly see passing whales, and we certainly see them off the southern coast as well. So Albany is an old whaling station for obvious reasons, is that there were a lot of whales to catch in the Arctic at that time. So how does the Arctic food web sort of fit into all of this? So you can see here just all the various interlinks, and you've got our friend here sitting here pretty much in the central player in this food web here is our guy, the krill. But you can see all of the various links going through here from our krill, directly up to our large migrating whales, but also through to various other elements of the food web. So you can see that these small guys are playing a very important, fundamental, basic role at the bottom of the food web, keeping everything ticking along. So that's our basic interaction of our food web down in the Arctic, where people are, where our whales are migrating to. When we talk about whaling, there are many ways to divide it up, but you can kind of look at 3 eras. So you can look at what's called, the very early era. So this is the kind of stuff when we have the establishment of whaling coming out of, well, at least in, the 1600s in America. So we have those northeast areas in America being in the business of whales. These are really tackling right whales. These are whales that were slow moving, close to the coast. These were the only type of whales that were likely to be picked up. We then had the boom in the American-style ocean-going collection of whales. So we're no longer, bound to be just looking at the coast. We've gone out into the open seas, and we're essentially systematically depleting stocks in one location and moving further and further out. So that period, if you ask me, it would be characterized by we'll completely fish out one area. We then go on and go out, and we had these ship systems going out for longer and longer cycles. So I find it, personally, I find it quite interesting that, people were not going, hey, aren't we doing something crazy here? We fish out an area, or we whale out the area, and then the next year we do our next cycle and we have to go out longer and we have to go out further. And we just kept doing this. It's genuine. I find it really astounding that we did that, but that's what we did. And then sort of really after, once we start getting into the modern era, so getting to around that World War I type stage where we start to see modern factory ships coming into play. So we're starting to get away from wooden boats, and we're really starting to see the benefits of mechanization coming into play. And we call these, factory boats. This became increasingly sophisticated as we moved through the 20th century, or at least the first half of the 20th century. But that kind of is where it got to. So this evolution from, at the start, pre-1700s, you're really looking at people, small boats, canoes, out just tackling whales, or actually picking up whales that have become beached or washed up. Okay, so that's sort of the process. Then we have this era of ocean-going whaling, which is the era that Moby Dick is set in, where we're, going further and further reaches around the globe, ending up in the Antarctic waters and the Arctic waters, chasing whales. And then we have the modern era, where we start to see, the power of industrial technology being brought to bear on the problem. And you can imagine that, the harvest rate goes up as we get our technology coming in. So what were the sort of advances in technology that I'm just sort of describing there? So we see, we're doing not too well. If you're a right whale, yeah, we're doing lots of damage, but we were not damaging all populations of whales. We see, steam-powered and fuel-powered ships opening up the oceans. And then we call it, we've got a factory on the ocean. We've been able to move. We don't have to keep coming back to shore. We've actually moved all the factory processes out into the ocean. So we've got, constant cycle of collection and coming back in. So what did we do? How did we, what sort of stock did we do? So, well, at least for the Southern Hemisphere, the numbers are pretty staggering. So if we look at blue whales, we managed to get the population down. We got rid of 90% of the population. Humpback whales, the same difference. So you see big numbers, but we didn't have, some people have done some estimates now, trying to get, so we need to sort of be going back to, inferring populations in the 1600s. So it's quite hard for us to have good, methods of getting a sense of the numbers back then to get, true numbers of what the population was in its natural state. But we do have some estimates in here. Now these were the largest types of whales. So these were ones that were very attractive to catch. Okay, so they generated the most oil. So that's a primary ingredient. And our sperm whales, so these are toothed whales. So these also had the spermaceti, which was the particularly high quality oil. So we took a lot of whales from the ocean, right? We really depleted these stocks. Now the system, so how did we manage this? So we've heard a little bit about total allowable catch in the system. So the way that the whaling system was set up was, well, this is a multi-species fishery when you think about it, okay? So we've got different types of whales that we're looking at here. So what they did was they came up with what was called the blue whale quota system. Okay, so here I've got the blue whale quota system. So the way that this thing worked was that we said, well, a blue whale, well, that generates how much amount of oil. So let's define everything as the amount of oil that we can get from a blue whale. And then we move on to fin whales. So when we look at the amount of oil we can get out of a fin whale, we need 2 of them to get the equivalent of a blue whale. And you can see here as we go on, sea whales and minke whales again is, I forget exactly how many it's minke whales, but they're smaller again than sea whales. So you can see the system was built around this kind of treating it as a production unit. It doesn't say, oh, let's think about the production system, or the quota system didn't say, gee, what's the sustainable catch for blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, and sea whales, or look at it in any way like that. It just said, well, this is the amount of oil, or oil equivalent or baleen equivalent that we want to take out of the system. Let's measure how much oil and let's just define that. So we're not actually putting any restrictions on whether you take blue whales, fin whales, or sea whales. We're just saying, this is how much oil you can take. So you can see that would let you completely deplete a fish stock if you just have this sort of overall quota. It just says, no, you're not doing anything wrong. Your quota was this is how much oil you can take. No restriction whatsoever on what type of whales you would look for to take that from. So some other history that we've got coming in here in the whaling side of things is our International Whaling Commission. So we started to, people started to recognize that we were really taking large numbers of whales out, like as our technology, our ability to harvest at sea increased dramatically, mechanization came into play, much more efficient at killing whales. We started to see that we had a problem, and internationally we agreed that there was a problem. This takes place in the ocean, so you can see that we don't have, it's not like around the coast of Australia, that we need some mechanism to regulate what's happening, and this saw the establishment of the International Whaling Commission. So this is what it was doing. Now this is important to note. What was it doing? It was trying to set quotas. It wasn't about conservation per se. It was about what would be the maximum or the optimal harvest rate. Can we get some historical information? Can we work out what the best biomass is? And then can we start giving people agreed limits on how much they should take? Okay, so the International Whaling Commission was not about conservation per se. It was about treating this as a renewable resource. So we might have different views about how things have evolved today, but at the time, that was the logic that we had. And it had this crazy, I've already sort of identified, this crazy blue whale unit mechanism. So it wasn't really thinking through how do we maintain and manage all of these different whales. It was just a really functional, from the fisher, from the whaler's perspective, that's the optimal system for them. So there were really some material deficiencies in what it was trying to do. The International Commission did run into some problems. So even though we had identified, so you can see this date here, so you might also note that we're just coming out of the war. So we're trying to set up some international architecture here. What happened? We had lots of problems. So we had lack of enforcement. So it was pretty hard to enforce, like who's doing the monitoring. It's not like now where we have GPS on the fleets and we can monitor them. We also had a lot of illegal activity, not like state-sponsored illegal activity. So the USSR, it's subsequently been revealed, took huge numbers of whales outside its quota, and we also saw, these being our quotas being well and truly exceeded. We also see once the scientific evidence starts coming in. So we're moving through time here, and we really got the scientists saying, actually, we really do know something about what's going on here. We are still stuck with this crazy quota limit. We're looking at the total stocks, and we're saying, you need to stop. You need to completely cease allowing any activity with blue whales and hump whales. Yet we continue with the blue whale unit metric. Finally, it's not until 1972 that we see that that metric being removed. Okay, so you see the science. So this is this interaction why it's science and people. We've got the science. Just because you've got the science in 1963 doesn't, if you don't understand, if you don't have the social scientists to help, navigate the political process or the bureaucratic process or the legal infrastructure that you need to put in place to do this, you get nowhere. So it's basically a decade later until we start getting something happen. What are the impacts of all of this? So what we saw, populations reduced to the point where they are functionally extinct. Okay, we have problems with genetic biodiversity. We also now have when you're vulnerable, you can have things like when populations are low, ship strikes, which happen pretty regularly. That can cause problems. So you're now vulnerable. So even though things may not be extinct, they're highly threatened. And of course, this we saw, going back, looking at the food web, this gets fundamentally changed. We've taken a huge amount of the structure in the food web out by taking out all of these animals. So I've got two examples here, and I often have doom and gloom examples, but they're not both going to be doom and gloom examples here. The first one is, so I've mentioned the right whale. So this is a North Atlantic right whale. So this is off North America, where we've one of the first whales that was targeted. So it was slow moving near the coast, and you can see there from my date, you can see that this is north, so New England in America basically. These are where we've got harvesting. So you've really got the foundation. We've just got the transfer in New York. We've got the former Dutch settlement. You've got these new establishments in the north of England. Sorry, in New England. So in that northeast corner of the US, harvesting them. And you can see now that the population has been dramatically reduced. And why is that the case? So if we think of here, it's because we're down here. Okay, so this here is, I've got time. This is my population number. This is my biomass growth. There's a theoretical limit. So we're going to get biomass growing. It's going to be, here is the high growth rate. Here is the very slow growth rate. So what's really happening is we're down here. So even though that we've stopped any activity, and in fact, we stopped a long time ago for right whales, they've been protected for a long, long time now. One of the first that were placed under protection, but we've got nowhere. Okay, why is that? Because we've got down here. So this is the way biomass grows. You're either at the biological limit, you're not going to get anything more, or you're down here and reproduction is low. There's so few to mate that it's difficult to find a mate. So when we look at that, you can see that our population growth rate depends on the birth rate. Well, there's a slow reproductive cycle, okay? So long interval between births. And then when you have this long interval between birth and a low population, we get ship strikes, which are, kill a few whales a year. And you can see that when we've got such a low population, so we're down here, 2 to 3 years in each breeding cycle, we're not adding a whole lot of new whales to the population. Then we lose a few in addition to normal processes. These are additional ones that we lose. So the small mortality rate has a big impact on growth. Okay, so that's the bad news story. Here is our good news story, slightly more humpback whales. So again, we say that these were really population collapsed, really driven down to critical levels in the system, almost at the point of extinction. So we really got to the limit of doing that. And then what we start to see is that we start to see along here. So these are individual estimates and samples. You have some measures of uncertainty around these samples. And you see here, we didn't get any samples for a while. And then they start to see some uptick here. Okay, so what have we got going on here? We've made it by this point in time, by about a decade ago, you can see we're starting to hit the point where maybe we've got the trend going up. You can see that here. Okay, so we've gone through the critical collapse in the population, and now we're into the bit where the biomass can grow quite strongly. And there's an article published not that long ago in Marine Policy saying downlisting their conservation status. Okay, so we're saying that we're on the scientific evidence, that this is a good thing. Okay, stocks have recovered sufficiently for us to have some confidence that we might move them from one category along in, say, for example, the red line index of categorizing the risk. So sometimes here's an example where we did crush the population, we started to get things back. We have other examples where things are not going so well. So if we think about this, we're saying that our right whale is still down here, but with our humpback whale, we've got on the path of high growth rates. And that summary is an opportune time for a break.